I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. We have one more year-end episode for you. I recently sat down with three of our staff critics, Szalai, Alexandra Jacobs, and Dwight Garner, to talk about their years in reading. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Hello, everyone.
Hey, Gilbert.
Hi, Gilbert.
We could go in many directions. Usually, the staff critics for the New York Times pick their top 10 books of the year. That is not something that we did this year. I think perhaps, you can tell me if I'm wrong, to the delight of some or all. But what I want to do is talk about your year in reading, what things you loved, what things you returned to, new or old. I was trying to figure out thematically which was a way to start, but one thing I noticed, whether it was in the top 10 books that we worked on together as a group or in individual books that you reviewed, we did a lot of memoirs. And memoirs are they're an accordion-like form, they're very pliable form. I did want to start with celebrity memoirs because at least in the back quarter of the year, the celebrity memoir was huge. We had Bono, we had Matthew Perry, Jeanette McCurdy, Quentin Tarantino wrote a celebrity memoir of sorts. And Alexandra, on your list of favorite books of the year that we're going to be publishing in the New York Times Book Review, you talked about two in particular. I was wondering if you could give us a little taste of why those were to your liking.
I did, and I just want to say that many, if not most, celebrity memoirs are absolutely terrible. So I didn't choose these two lightly. One was Molly Shannon's memoir, Hello, Molly, which I thought was charmingly titled. And, all the cliches are true. I laughed, I cried. I love Molly Shannon. Her portrayal of Sally O'Malley on Saturday Night Live, an enthusiastic woman of 50 who just will not go down for the count, is etched in my brain. And I didn't know that Molly Shannon had had a terrible tragedy in her childhood. And I guess I won't reveal it here, although it's been widely reported. But she reveals it very quickly in her book. And I'm not going to say it's all uphill from there. It's many peaks and valleys, but it's an amazing story of human resilience and familial resilience, really. There's so many sort of antic adventures and adventurous antics in this book. For example, Molly Shannon is 13 and she takes an 11-year-old friend. They decide to hop a plane and go to New York, and they do it. They pull it off. They hop on a plane alone. This was obviously a different era, pre-9/11. They get on a plane and they go to New York. That alone, I feel, could be like an exceptional movie. Imagining Molly Shannon and her little friend, running around New York like hooligans. She carries this spirit into adulthood when she's trying to make it in show business, and which is a long, long slog for her. She and a friend pretend they're working as assistants in the office of David Mamet. And instantly, all their calls get returned. And, it's like Mamet wrote in one of his plays, like, always be closing. Like, that's exactly what Molly Shannon did. She just would let nothing stop her to reach her goal.
So without naming any names, because we're not here to talk smack about anyone, what is it about the celebrity memoir, most celebrity memoirs, that make them not great?
They're ghostwritten. They're ghostwritten.
Tell me more.
Well, most celebrity memoirs are really just the product of a famous person sitting down with a writer, and that writer, many of them very skilled, turning those tapes into something approximating the celebrity's voice. I think the good ones, in the case of Molly Shannon, she had a collaborator, Sean Wilsey. Years ago, Andre Agassi did a great one with J.R. Moringer of the Los Angeles Times that was equally excellent. You can feel it when there's an element of collaboration between the celebrity and the writer. And, some celebrities are good writers.
I would also add, Alexandra, that for a lot of people, they just don't want to spill the beans. There are many examples of this. I happen to know an older man who's a former baseball player, kind of well-known. He has the most amazing, kind of filthy, wild stories you've ever heard in your life. And he recently had a memoir come out, and no one noticed it. It wasn't from a big press. All the stories were just watered down because he couldn't out people. He couldn't say what really happens, which is why Jim Bouton's, I think, Ball 4 was a big deal, because he actually did make some enemies.
To speak of a book that probably was not ghostwritten, given who wrote it, one of my favorite reviews of the back half of the year, Dwight, was yours on David Milch's memoir.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's kind of review where all you have to do as a critic sometimes is stand back and just print the best parts of the book, because it's such a great book. I mean, I didn't know a lot about David Milch. I mean, of course, some listeners may know he's the guy, the writer-producer who did NYPD Blue and Deadwood and other things. But it turns out he has this amazing life. His father was this mobbed-up doctor in Buffalo, where the kind of guy, if you're all shovel full of holes, you would take your guy to him because you couldn't take him to a hospital. You get arrested. So you go to David Milch's dad. And so he knew these wild characters. Then he went to Yale, where he was a drug addict and shot things up, and was also an acolyte of Robert Penn Warren there, and went to L.A. and was a madman out there. And he's just a larger-than-life figure, just an amazing, crazy life. And his memoir about how he does his work and his writing is just really good. I met someone recently, an older writer. We were talking at this party, and I said, "Have you read the Milch?" And he said, "I have read the Milch." He said, "It changed my life." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because Milch recommends that every writer," he did this because he wrote dialogue, but every writer spend at least an hour a day just doing dialogue. Just invent two characters, have them talk to each other for an hour. And it's weirdly great advice, I think, for any kind of writing person, if you want to write fiction or whatever. But the book is like that. It's filled with weird, glorious nuggets.
Jen, one book that you were big on, I know, and that actually ended up on our top 10 books of the year was Stay True by Wasu, which is a memoir. It's not a celebrity memoir. He's a writer. He's a music critic. He writes for The New Yorker. But what was it about that memoir, which is very different from these two, that really appealed to you?
Very, very different. So, the premise of the memoir is Sue is recounting his friendship in college with a guy named Ken. And Sue and Ken at the time, as people who were basically coming of age, were very, very, very different. Sue describes himself as almost a generic music snob. He really cultivates his tastes, sees it as something that was really precious to him, and constructs a persona around that. Whereas Ken is described as a frat boy. Ken is Japanese American. His family has been in the country for several generations, whereas Sue is Taiwanese American, the child of immigrants. And so he recounts this friendship, which actually lasted for a very short time because, as he describes very early on in the book, Ken was suddenly killed in a carjacking 3 years after they met. The story is really about coming of age. It's about friendship. It's also about the development of an artistic sensibility that's frankly more open, I think, than the one that Sue came into college with. And it turns out to be a book that's not only, of course, as you might imagine, quite moving, but is also very funny. There's a lot of also 90s nostalgia for anybody who grew up during that time. I think you'll see a lot of the things in the book really resonate really powerfully, and certainly brought me back. It's like one of those books that almost imperceptibly changes the way you think about the world, but that at the end, things look a little bit different.
Now, I know a few of the critics on the desk worked several years ago on a big project about memoirs. Memoir?
Memoir.
Memoir?
Memoir.
On a big project about
it.
memoir. As I said, it could be a lot of things. It can be a crappy celebrity memoir. It could be a great celebrity memoir. It could be a memoir by someone who's recalling what it was like to grow up in Berkeley in the 90s. It could also be an attempt to grapple with one's very interesting and difficult father. And one of the books that I enjoyed most this summer when I picked it up was one that I know you wanted to talk about, Alexandra, which was also a poet.
Oh, I love Also a Poet. That is the book when people find out I have this job and they say, "What should I read?" That's the one that I point them to that I'm fairly sure almost everyone will like. So it's by a woman named Ada Calhoun, who's written a few books, including one about perimenopausal women and one about St. Mark's Place. But anyway, this I really think was her breakout book. Basically, the premise is her father is or was, because he died quite recently, the New Yorker art critic Peter Shedal. And his presence kind of loomed over her development as a writer. She was raised by these bohemian East Village writers and in this milieu that included all these famous or semi-famous writers and artists. And, it was hard. Her father had taught her about the poet Frank O'Hara, and it had been something they shared, a sort of literary common ground. And then she found out that he had started a biography of Frank O'Hara that he'd never finished. And she took it upon herself to complete it. And I mean, talk about 90s nostalgia. This is like 70s or 60s nostalgia. She goes down into the basement of their East Village apartment building and finds all these dusty tapes that contain interviews he's done with associates of Frank O'Hara. And that's a biographer's dream or memoirist dream to come across this material that hasn't been used. I think Ada could hear on some of the tapes, like she was being discussed, she was a baby, it just, everything sort of came together. So she takes upon herself to finish it and encounters all these obstacles and winds up writing something that is a combination of memoir and biography. And I just loved it because it sort of collapsed genres in a way that I found very exciting.
I was kind of fascinated at how she kind of outed him as a bad dad while he was still alive.
Yes. And he at least publicly, he loved the book, or he said he did. And it was satisfying to see them reach some kind of resolution there. Parenting wasn't even a verb then, it seems, the way it is now.
I did find that book particularly moving. I also found one, and this is moving in a completely different way, that you were big on, Dwight, which was Amy Bloom's In Love.
Amy Bloom is a writer that I've kind of avoided before this book because her novels have these titles that I find really generic. I mean, one is called Come to Me, one is called Love Invents Us, one is called Happy Us, and they just sound like the kind of thing I might not want to read, but I'm an idiot because she's a terrific writer. She has this sort of wised up New York voice that reminds me of Nora Ephron or Sloane Crosley or Allegra Goodman or someone like that. This book is heartbreaking. It's about her husband who develops Alzheimer's, and they travel to Switzerland to go to a clinic where, it's a euthanasia clinic essentially. And the story of their meeting, of their coupledom, of their lives together is just, it's not just poignant, it's hilarious and it's wise, and one of the best books of the year.
Jen, one of your jobs here as the nonfiction book critic is, fortunately or unfortunately, to write a lot about politics, about political books, political memoir. And I know that this year you had to handle a couple and that there are some more on the horizon in early 2023. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, particularly when it comes to memoirs by former Trump officials, like where are we at in this stage? There have been a lot. There have been dozens. There might be a couple dozen more. How do you handle them?
Well, it was funny when we were talking about celebrity memoir. I was wondering to myself if Mike Pence counts as a celebrity.
Oh, yeah.
Politician memoir I see as sort of a subset almost of the celebrity memoir in a way. And I think it does suffer from some of the things that you've already talked about. One of them is that they're ghostwritten, but really the main thing, I think, is that if it's a politician's memoir and the politician still has political ambitions, then of course it's going to be curated in such a way where all the most interesting parts are going to be ironed out or explained away. And so, for example, in the case of Mike Pence, I think it's pretty clear as he does his book tour right now that he's sort of been hinting at, despite the fact that he's really still connected to Trump, even though he did certify the election on January 6th, he still hints at political ambitions. And so the memoir that he recently came out with, So Help Me God, I think the title is sort of fascinating for all kinds of reasons.
I thought you were saying, so help me.
So help me God. So help us God. He's trying to do several things at once. Lay the groundwork for why he's somebody who is just unfailingly full of integrity. But secondly, also try to rationalize some of the things that happened during the Trump administration that he was totally on board with at the time and that he knows are still considered at the very least controversial. And so it was sort of a strange experience reading it. I also reviewed another memoir by somebody who was in the administration, William Barr, formerly the Attorney General. And even though he's not a politician per se, he is still somebody who clearly feels he has a lot of explaining to do.
How do you approach politician memoirs?
Carefully.
They're very different from regular memoir, as you point out. Often they are written to serve a political purpose. What is the mindset as a critic that you need to go into reading these books with?
Well, I think first of all, I just have to accept the fact that in terms of maybe an aesthetic reading experience. I have to put that part of it to the side, that it's not necessarily going to be something that's merely beautiful or entertaining. It might not be any of those things, but I go into it usually with a set of questions, which is the main one tends to be, why this book now? And even though books usually have a gestation period of a bit of time, I think that these books are coming out for a reason right now. And part of it is that there was just sort of the endless, especially when it came to Trump, this endless appetite, it seemed like, for books about his administration, even though his administration was in the news constantly. So I'm always trying to figure out when I read these things whether they tell us something new, something that we didn't know before, and also trying sometimes as much as I can to, I hate this expression, but I'll just say it, read between the lines to see if there's anything that can be sussed out about the writer's motivations, to get a sense of what not only they are saying explicitly, but also what they're not saying. I think that's important.
That sounds like the easiest task. I'm happy I don't have to do it.
Doesn't it sound fun?
It sounds great. It sounds great. We've talked a lot about nonfiction. I think we should take a little break and pick things up in a minute with some fiction recommendations. I'm back with Jen Szalai, Alexandra Jacobs, and Dwight Garner, and we are discussing our year in reading. We talked a lot about some nonfiction books that we love this year. I'd love to jump over to Dwight to ask you about a book that I absolutely adored. I know that you did too, Jennifer Egan's The Candy House.
I'm a sucker for a big style and for a lot of smarts and just a hard-headed, just someone who sees the world in a novel way, in a smart way, and has things to say about a lot of aspects of culture and everything, from the way people dress to how they think to how they work on their laptops. Robert Christgau, the great rock critic, said he likes his prose with extra wontons. And I feel like Jennifer Egan is just wonton after wonton. It's just so great. And this is the follow-up, this novel, The Candy House, to A Visit from the Goon Squad. And a lot of people wrote that they thought the sequel was not as good as the first. I think it's twice as good as the first. I think she's coming into her own as a major, major writer. I'm 57 years old, which is not that old, certainly not young, but I'm aware lately of feeling like all the stars from my literary sky as a youth are winking out. They're dying. Like, people I look forward to books from aren't there anymore. I'm not going to name any names. We all know who will come to mind, male and female. And I look around and ask myself, well, who's replacing them? Like, what writer... This is a sort of horrible... What writer, if they were hit by a bus today, would we really think to ourselves, this is a loss to the culture? Like, this is a big deal. And of course, many probably. But Jennifer Egan, on the basis of this book, and I think is up there for me as someone whom I'm just glad to be alive and to be able to read what she writes for the next 20 years that she has left as a literary talent. And the book is kind of small in its way. I don't want to oversell it to any listener because it's a sort of fickle, pointed intellectual book about a bunch of crazy characters, movie producers and internet savants. And it's all set in New York City in the 90s, and it rockets up to today, and it goes back and forth. But I just have this feeling of power from it. I just feel like this is a writer, I've said this already, but working at a very high level. And I just can't wait to read what she does next.
One of my concerns, and part of the reason I held off on reading it for as long as I did, was because, and I think many other people might share this, I didn't feel like I had the time to go back and reread A Visit from the Goon Squad before dipping into The Candy House. I found, however, that I did not need to, even though it may have been a better experience, I did not need to. And it was so satisfying regardless.
Yeah, it's kind of like the two new Cormac McCarthy novels. I mean, you don't have to read them together. The first one is the great one, the comic one. It's called The Passenger. The second one, Stella Maris, is a sort of coda, and it kind of plays out. But you don't have to have read either one to appreciate the other. And they're kind of similar that way.
One question I always ask people at the end of the year, because I know that anybody who loves books and is a real reader is reading new books at the same time that they're reading old books, is what older books did you read for the first time this year? So I'm going to pose that question to each of you. I'm going to start with Jen.
So this year was the first year that I had read any fiction by Sigrid Nunez. I had read her memoir about Susan Sontag a few years ago, Sempre Susan, which I really enjoyed. And I remember thinking, I'd like to read more of her work. And then for whatever reason, it took me this long. And this was the year that I essentially joined her fan club. I read The Friend and What Are You Going Through, which I think are novels maybe that you reviewed, Dwight, really beautifully when they came out. It's interesting to think about. I was wondering if it was just part, or in part, I should say, because she's such a great writer, if it was also partly because of the moment that I felt I was in, that we are in with the pandemic. I mean, her books have a lot to do with mortality, aging, getting older, remembering times past. Both of them I found incredibly moving. And so I'm looking forward to reading. I think somebody recommended a book she wrote that's from the perspective of a marmoset, I think. Is that, I don't know if I have that right.
She has one about a former dancer too, and I'm blanking on the title now, but it's great.
Okay. Oh, and I also did start reading, which I'm going to return to. She wrote a book that's actually about a pandemic that came out, I don't know, years ago. And a lot of it feels really scarily prescient, just in terms of the emotional valences and imagery that's in the book. And so she's somebody that now I just want to read everything that she's written.
Alexandra?
I tend to feel very oppressed and ambivalent about technology and very conscious of the ways that technology figures or doesn't figure in contemporary literature. So I'm always thinking about that whenever I read novels. Like, oh, this is a historical novel. Are they doing that because it's better to go back to a time before iPhones interrupted the narrative? Or I'm always looking for ways that current authors integrate technology into what they're doing. So somebody I went back to this year, and it's a little corny, it's almost a cliche at this point. People at the Times have often written about this author as a sort of underappreciated beloved. But Laurie Colwin is somebody I went back to this year. She died fairly young, and she wrote these perfect little novels of domestic contentment, disruption. There are affairs, but it's not bodice ripping. It's just people living their lives. And I remember going back to them this year because I was thinking, boy, would this affair be arranged differently if there was an iPhone in the mix? Like you'd have to turn off the location finder or whatever. I just think about that stuff all the time. She also wrote cookery books and recipes and that sort of thing in these cozy times when we hunker down in our bunkers and make turkey or whatever. Laurie's one I went back to, like a cliche.
No, she's the best.
That's not cliche. Dwight.
Well, I was reading her as well. I'm not going to. I finished a book this year, and I'm not going to try to sell it now. But I'll just say it's a book about literature and food, and how food has worked in literature from modern day writers, Ocean Vuong and Brian Washington and Crying in H Mart, the memoir, all the way back to Homer. And I found myself reading a lot of food books this year. And Laurie Colwin is, she's so funny and so quotable. Can I tell you about her most disgusting habit? Okay, I was reading it, and it's in my book. You can buy it all next year for $19. But it's she admits, and she writes an essay about coffee in one of those books. Cooking and More Cooking, I think, are her two food collections. And she says that she likes to, when people are around, she goes around to everyone's leftover coffee cup and pours what's left into a glass and puts ice on it and drinks it. So everyone else's coffee.
I do that with wine.
I do that with cocaine. That's so funny you would say that. I love it. It's so gross. Anyway, I miss her. And so I read a lot of food this year. I also read, when I'm free, I try to read, I read the Brits sometimes. I find them inspiring as a writer. I aspire to a certain kind of dryness, at least some of the time. Or at least I like dry writers. And I read Jessica Mitford's letters this year. She was the sort of the Pinko Mitford, and wrote The American Way of Death, and Evelyn Waugh's essays, and the poet John Betjeman's essays. That was the kind of stuff that I really loved this year. But Gilbert, you're brand new editor of the New York Times Book Review. You did culture for a long time, and now you're all books. What did you find yourself reading this year when you weren't reading articles and reviews and incoming mail?
One of the things I have been shocked at in my first 4 months of this job is how little time I have for reading. I'm hoping that 2023 proves to be very different. But one of the most satisfying reading experiences I had this year, I have an 8-year-old, and I'm finding it a wonderful opportunity to read a lot of children's classics that I never had the chance to read the first time. I read to my son over the course of a month at bedtime, The Phantom Tollbooth. And that, holy cow, what were my parents doing not introducing me to that book? That is just such a playful, delightful, linguistically inventive book. I loved it. I loved it so much. And I just want to read it again on my own in one go outside of the context of bedtime reading. That was great. I listened to a lot of audiobooks during my commute, and the John le Carré memoir, The Pigeon Tunnel, which he reads, was particularly delightful. I did not know anything about his crazy family life, a con artist father, and how that sort of affected his entire conception of truth and falsity. And then every year, as I always do, I read the new Stephen King and the new Ellen Hildebrand, and I enjoyed them both.
The best reason to have kids is just for reading them the books. I mean, that's
until
really the only
reject
reason.
them, until they tell you, no, Mommy, I don't want to read Maud Hart Lovelace.
They should be kicked out of the house at that point.
I do want to ask, it's the end of the year, and if we're lucky, some of us get some time off at the end of the year. You're all book critics, and I'm very curious about how you spend any vacation time that you have, given that you read books all the time. Are you trying to avoid books altogether? Are you trying to catch up on stuff that you should have read this year? Are you looking ahead? Jen.
So I have one book that I hope to read over the holidays, which is The Years by Annie Ernaux. I've never read anything else by her, but some friends of mine and I are going to read it together and then talk about it in the new year. So I'm looking forward to that. But I will say that I feel like there's something about the pandemic especially that has made me feel like what I really need to do if I have any extra time over the holidays is see as many movies in the theater as
It's been
possible.
a good year for movies.
I've barely seen anything, so I'm hoping to see some things. I don't even know what at this point.
Can I interrupt, though? Did you just indicate that you're in a book group in addition to being a book critic for the New York Times?
Yeah, well, but because we read things that I don't get to read for my work. We read fiction mostly, except for the Ernaux, which is sort of on the line, I guess, but...
That's impressive.
That's where I read the Sigrid Nunez.
I was going to say I'd rather cut off a toe than do that, but maybe I can see it. I don't know. Maybe just no one asked me.
Well,
so
these are
I'm
fun friends, so this is nice.
Someone asked Dwight to be in their book group.
Please.
Dwight, what do you do when you have free time, particularly over the holidays?
You know, I like what I do, and I think I'm never really on vacation. And book
or maybe
critics,
you're always on vacation.
Maybe that's it, And if you're a book critic for the Times, there's always stuff coming up that's terrifying you. There's always some big book that you feel like you have to read 3 other books in order to review it. So I'm rarely on full vacation. But I'm on vacation all the time. So it's hard to say. When I really need to relax, I read cookbooks, and I have a lot of them. And my wife hates it because I end up leaving I leave them open for her, hoping I can cook as well, but I'll leave it open saying, crew will walk in and you want me to cook this, and it's always a 3-day project, So cookbooks for me.
Alexandra.
I just reviewed volume 1 of a new biography that's sort of done as a sessionography filled in of Paul McCartney. I sort of knew this because after Get Back last year, I'd gone on a Beatles literature binge. It's bottomless, like you could never reach the bottom. But I knew Mark Lewinson had done the first volume of a 3-volume book about the Beatles. I did not realize the first volume, the unabridged version, is 1,600 pages. And I like a challenge, Gilbert. What can I tell you? I think I need to read it. So going to get the unabridged version it's called Tune In.
I like Jen's answer the most. Let's go to the movies, Jen.
I also want to watch White Lotus, 2nd season.
Book critics do other things. They're not just reading books all the time.
Not just a busman's holiday.
Cooking, watching movies, watching TV. You're all...
drinking wine out of other people's cups.
Exactly. That's the grossest thing I've heard all week. I want to thank all of you for joining me here today to talk about your year in reading. Jen Szalai, Alexandra Jacobs, Dwight Garner. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks,
Gilbert.
Thank you to Jen Szalai, Alexandra Jacobs, and Dwight Garner for joining me to talk about their years in reading. We're going to take a holiday hiatus, and we will see you in 2023. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.